afternoon, everyone. It's Frank from Counterbalance. Welcome to our last webinar on financing of the Green Deal from the network of the Observatory of the Financing of the Green Deal. We will wait a little bit more to start, like 2 minutes or so, and then we'll start with the introduction and we begin. Afternoon again. Well, we're still not so many, but I would say we begin already. We'll see if other people come in. Welcome very much, everyone. This is the last webinar in a series that organized by Counterbalance, and it's part of the bigger project of the Observatory for Green Deal and Recovery Financing in the EU. This webinar is actually a follow-up of another one that we did a few weeks ago when we launched a report on the financing of the Green Deal, the EU public investments for the Green Deal. And now we will have the second part of the discussion, but we focus more specifically on the role of public energy and of industrial planning in a just transformation. And we will have this discussion with what I think is a very interesting panel. There is my colleague, Alexandra Gerasimcikova, who is the head of policy and advocacy at Counterbalance. We have Mathieu Strale, who is the researcher at the Institut de Gestion de l'Environnement et Aménagement du Territoire at the ULB in Brussels. And then we have Melanie Brusseler, who is a senior researcher in macrofinance and industrial planning at Commonwealth. And finally, we also have Olivier Vardakoulias, who is a finance policy coordinator at Can Europe. And we work as follows. We do 2 rounds of questions for each speaker, and then we open up the floor for Q&A. So let me start maybe with you, Alex. Let's start with the EIB, which is like a topic, the European Investment Bank, that as Counterbalance we work on a lot. What is the current strategy of the EIB towards industry, and how does it relate to the need for decarbonization in a socially and environmentally just way?
Yeah, thank you, Frank, and thank you everyone for joining today's discussion. Super nice to have such a nice panel of speakers together to discuss this very important topic. Again, I think before the European elections and generally with the state of play globally, this is very timely discussion. Actually, I think, yeah, indeed, like looking at the EIB's investments in terms of industrial planning is quite interesting because it really reflects overall lack of European policies in this regard. So overall, the way that the EIB is at the moment financing decarbonization, and in that regard, industrial development on the EU level, is really largely through the clean technologies support. So renewables, EVs, batteries, hydrogen. Now the EIB has also been promising to do more with regard to critical raw materials supply chains. So let's see how that will advance, because so far they have not been doing too much in this regard. And overall, the EIB investments follows the EU's approach of addressing market failures with public funds with regard to industry, right? I think the other speakers will also cover some of these topics, which is one of our biggest criticisms on the side of civil society is really this, leveraging private finance approach with the money. More concretely, the EIB has been focusing on supporting the EU, like this Green Deal Industrial Plan, the Net Zero Industry Act. Now, recently, also there is a talk of the EIB to support the EU's defense industrial strategy to increase financing for defense industry, also on the EU level. But overall, these Green Deal industrial policies specifically have been rather disappointing so far on the EU level, because it really means that not much money goes into it in terms of new funds made available, or like the big subsidies on the EU level. There is just no such big component of that. So it really is not really a competition with the US policies in this sense, as opposed to member state level, which is a bit more complicated. Generally, the industrial support then focuses a lot on oligopolies in the sense, but this is a general pattern on the EU industrial side at the moment in general, and unfortunately the EIB follows this type of path, also supporting huge companies like Iberdrola and Northvolt for their industrial policies. I think it's interesting that on the EU level, in terms of public finance and the way that the EIB approaches this, there is really many contradictions at the same time, which is interesting for us to expose and really like push forward there. For instance, with regard to financing hydrogen or any of the CCS, the various steel companies that are supposed to be the target of these investments, like ArcelorMittal, they're already saying that they will not be using hydrogen made in Europe, renewable hydrogen made in Europe, because it's just too expensive and it doesn't commercially make any sense for them to use it, even with the subsidies. So again, while we see these types of financings from finance on the side of the EIB, it's not always like very linked to reality on the ground as well. I think what's important is to really contextualize this within the just transition setting and the transition element in terms of jobs. I think Industrial had recently quite interesting numbers coming out that 2.5 million of jobs were lost in the industrialization since 2008. I would like to highlight specifically actually the Central and Eastern European region and the South Europe as well, because I think this core periphery divide is really not talked strongly enough on the EU level at all, while it's really essential blocker for having EU level industrial policy planning and then therefore more advanced policy public financing. Central and Eastern Europe will be particularly hardly hit by the just transition. The decarbonization of a lot of their industries is very difficult to make. For instance, Czech Republic and Slovakia, they're highly dependent on automobile sector, which is now also very reliant on foreign direct investment. So it's usually Western companies or generally rich countries, companies that have these automobile industries on the ground. But as they decarbonize, it's already predicted that a lot of jobs are supposed to be lost, because generally the EV sector, for example, like it doesn't need as many jobs as the current processes. So in Slovakia alone, I think the recent numbers were that around 4.5% of jobs could be lost alone because of decarbonization of the automobile industry. This is truly an insane number. So yeah, it just highlights how the industrial policy at the moment is very much disconnected from the just element of it, if we have such huge job losses as a result, unfortunately, which also then impacts local supply chains. For the EIB finance, therefore, I think it's also important to highlight that the way the EIB finances this core periphery divide, it also supports some of these huge companies in Eastern Europe. For example, LG's battery gigafactory in Poland, which again, in terms of industrial development, it's not going to replace these huge job losses that overall happen because of decarbonization, right? Like you can't replace destroyed local supply chains for the automobile industry by building one gigafactory. So I think also like this creates a lot of political discussion on the ground at the moment, whereas like some of the progressive political actors on the ground understand that there will be needed new jobs and new public financing for these kind of jobs for the just transition. But at the same time, they're in precarious position because there is really a lack of investments absolutely on the local level, and the EU finance generally rather follows this type of path at the moment. So in the end, just to sum up, basically the way we see like current public industrial spending happening at the moment, like it doesn't really deliver cheap, renewable, affordable energy for the people, doesn't really deliver jobs, and doesn't really deliver us transition. So yeah, I would leave it at that for now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alex, for this overview from the EIB and then widening it a bit. Melanie, I go to you. You work at Commonwealth, and you argued in some of the work that you do that the shift to renewables would actually be cheaper and more effective if it would be financed with public investments and with public investment with public energy companies. Could you explain this a little bit more? What's the advantage of public energy ownership, and why this is better than the market-based approach and this de-risking of private investors that we see so much now?
Sure, and I think it's helpful to. Thank you for having me, and congratulations on a really fantastic report. So to get into your question, I think it's always helpful to take a step back and think about what is the problem for decarbonizing the electricity sector. So electricity is the linchpin of the transition for most countries worldwide. Electricity systems are still largely dependent on fossil fuels, and then also decarbonization of a lot of other sectors such as housing, transportation, industrial production will be relying upon electrification. So we have to be both phasing out fossil fuels, building a lot of renewables, and also building the grid to kind of accommodate this big transformation and increase in electricity demand. And this transformation is a matter of investment and divestment, investment in renewables and in the grid, but then also divestment from existing fossil fuel generation capacity and related auxiliary infrastructure. But it's not the case that this is just a matter of like green line goes up, carbon line goes down. All around the world, electricity systems were largely built by the state through public enterprise and public utilities as post-war development projects, and they follow a very specific geospatial pattern where, for the most part, because fossil fuels are dispatchable power, they could be like ramped on and off just depending upon demand. Fossil fuel-based electricity systems kind of follow this pattern where generation is like kind of located near demand centers. There's some level of high voltage transmission and distribution to kind of carry electricity, regionally or throughout a country. But it's kind of like follows this set pattern, whereas renewables follow a different geospatial logic. They're variable. You have to like site them in different places. You need like a lot more generation capacity. It just kind of like looks very different. Therefore, when thinking about investing in the electricity system, it's not the case, again, that we just kind of like ramp up green. It really needs to be the synchronized project. You're rebuilding the grid once over again, following a very different logic. All the while, the grid needs to remain balanced such that, we keep, hospitals powered and things like that, throughout the transition. And so, in general, private investment is just kind of insufficient in like a holistic view for a large-scale investment program because due to the profit imperative and liquidity preference, which is kind of this famous Keynesian phrase to allude to the fact that private capital is very cautious. It's investing in the face of great uncertainty. Therefore, it will in aggregate and just kind of in like a macro sense err towards underinvestment in general. But then when thinking about electricity, in global context, and especially in Europe, actually, even where like electricity grids proper have remained in public ownership, there's been a move towards privatization and liberalization of electricity, which what that does is creates fragmentation. It's no longer just a single unitary actor in a country who's investing in electricity generation. It's like a fragmented set of actors who will be investing based upon project by project level profitability. And so that just really creates this issue in terms of getting like a functional investment program where you're investing, like thinking what does the system need in terms of both building a functioning like end state renewable system, but also keeping the grid balanced as you transition, just requires the system functioning approach to investment that this privatization and fragmentation is just ill-equipped to deliver. And in global context, and especially in Europe, as we're discussing, there's been a move to try to be increasing renewable deployment amidst this privatization and fragmentation of electricity. And this is inadequate, as I've said, kind of in a general sense, but also when thinking about renewables specifically and how they behave in liberalized wholesale markets, as you find throughout Europe. It's an issue because, as Brett Christophers demonstrates pretty robustly in his recent book, The Price is Wrong, and others point at this as well, renewables are not that profitable as an enterprise in general, but then especially in these volatile wholesale markets, they just kind of face structural issues where it's low profitability, but then also it's really volatile, which can pose debt servicing issues that fossil fuel-based generation doesn't quite face in the same way. So this really just hinders investment in general and kind of prevents this kind of coherent, synchronized project that's really essential to like delivering the transition well. And so many de-risking regimes that are attempting to induce private investment are doing so in a way that like they're tools that perhaps are bringing renewables online, especially in the era of low interest rates and low inflation. A lot of de-risking subsidies have to do with applying like ex-ante fixed prices to projects to kind of prevent volatility that can then induce private investment. But we're seeing quite a lot of issues as we move away from the era of low interest rates and low inflation in general. And so I think it's important to stress that whether it's like through de-risking or it's through direct public investment, the public always pays for, like will always pay for the energy transition. Through de-risking, it's mostly through state subsidies and then higher consumer bills. Like the idea that things are privately financed, I think it can be a bit of a misnomer because whether or not the credit and equity that goes into a project initially is private or not, it's ultimately going to be either consumer bills or the taxpayer that funds that later. And so just in general, that's an issue. But we also stress in our report from Commonwealth that just because state investment faces structurally lower capital costs, so like the state borrows on debt markets much more cheaply than a private company would, for any given investment program, it will just be structurally cheaper on debt servicing alone. We found if you follow the Labour Party's proposed public energy company, GB Energy, their proposed like initial capitalization. Through that alone, it would save between 125 to 208 million pounds per year on interest alone for every year that the debt was being serviced relative to if that was privately financed. And then in general, public energy companies, beyond that, just the debt costs, can undertake investment more decisively following the system's coherent approach. But then there's also other ways where it can cut costs, such as by amortizing debt over much longer time horizons. There's the ability to cross-subsidize projects when it's not like this fragmented system. Also just choosing to have lower prices and not, issue as big of like a return to the shareholders, for example. So just in general, it's structurally cheaper and I think structurally more effective than relying on private enterprise, even if it's really heavily publicly backstopped.
Great to see that you find this so funny. I took two really interesting aspects. One is I really like your argument that even if it's so-called privately financed, in the end it's consumers and taxes that pay for this, so it's public in the end still. And the number on the difference in debt servicing between public and private financing is I think that we should use these numbers. So thanks a lot. Mathieu, now over to you. I know you must be super eager to talk about national public energy in Belgium, but let's first go to the industrial aspect, actually, because if you take serious what Melanie was saying, then this requires really that governments take a much more central role and a proactive approach in the transition. And how do you see this for industrial policy and the needs that this industrial policy helps to bring forward a just transformation?
Hi, thank you, Frank, and thank you for the invitation. I think that if we want to understand how it works, it's good to take an example. And one good example is the current policy on transition in car industry in Europe, because it is one of the most important sector in the industry at the European level. And for now, the electrification is led by European private car manufacturer with public subsidies, like, for example, in Belgium through the company car policy. And the result is it encourages the production of very expensive and large vehicles, which consume lots of resources and energy and that are unaffordable for workers. And why? Just because these vehicles generate more short-term profits. This is the only reason. And the second step is the fact that as public subsidies begin to be too expensive for governments, for example, in relation with the return of austerity, there is a risk that there will be cuts in these public subsidies. It is already the case in Belgium, in Germany, and with direct consequences on jobs. Closure of production lines at Volkswagen in Germany, threats on the Audi factories in Brussels. In fact, this public subsidies to private actor is a strategy that has led to the same dead-end scenarios for other sectors like solar panels or wind turbines. First, you have a very high level of public subsidies. It creates a boom in the demand that private European manufacturers are unable to meet. And then there are cuts in these subsidies because they are too expensive for public budgets. And so European manufacturers suddenly found themselves without any demands. They closed down or they relocated the production elsewhere. And so in fact, public money feeds and worsens the market anarchy, which is a very big paradox. And these public subsidies to the private sector end up on workers' bill, like in energy, on green taxes, or on job cuts in factories. And then what happened on the political level, the right and the far-right parties try to make people believe that the solution is to keep the production as it has always been. So, for example, making petrol or diesel cars so that we can have, let's say, cheap cars and we can keep jobs in factories. But in fact, it's completely false because the problem is not linked with technology, but with production choices, control, and policies. And if the decision is in the hands of private giants, jobs and production of cheap products or affordable products or useful products will not be the priority. And in fact, the multiple plant closure and job cuts in the automotive sector during the last decades prove it. And so what's the alternative? In fact, the alternative, you can find some very interesting elements in the works of trade unions like CGT, the French trade union CGT Renault, or in NGOs like Transport and Environments. What they say about car production, they say that we should produce small, recyclable electric vehicles that are affordable, that create and protect jobs in the factories, but also in the subcontractors, and that can address the needs for some people that must have cars because they live in the countryside or they need to move during nights, etc. And at the same time, we also need more trains, buses, trams, bicycles, even wind turbines that can be produced by workers of the current automotive sectors. But it will only happen if we have trainings and income protections that are guaranteed by public bodies and by a very strong social protection, which is completely the opposite of the current European green industry policy that is, in fact, only led by the immediate needs of the biggest private actors without any long-term visions, without any coordination even at the European level.
But for going a bit into it and really focusing on one specific sector that really makes it more tangible, I think. Olivier, I want to go to you. I think that Mathieu already mentioned the disastrous effect of return of austerity. Actually, in 2 weeks ago when we had our first webinar, MEP Philippe Lambert, he was saying something interesting, saying that actually, like, many of the politicians who are in general in support of climate action, they do magical thinking because they want to have the climate action, but they don't want to put the money on the table to finance it. And I know that you have done some work on like showing like what is the investment gap of what is needed to finance either what the EU itself proposes right now, or also like what is needed if you want to do really like a just transformation. Can you explain this a little bit, maybe?
Sure. Thanks a lot for having me on this great panel. So in terms of the investment needs and so on, I'll start from the investment needs and then I'll go to the investment gaps. I think that makes sense. What usually refers to the investment needs are essentially the additional investments that are needed on a sectoral basis. So typically you look at all the different sectors, transport, energy, and so on. You look at how many investments would have happened in a counterfactual scenario where, climate change doesn't exist, basically, to replace your infrastructure, your amortization and stuff. And then you look essentially at the difference between that counterfactual scenario and the additions that you need, in order to deliver ambitious climate targets, right? And the Commission and every study does that typically by sector. So, housing sector, transport sector, industry, and so on and so forth. So what we do know is that to meet, the Commission's target, which are not aligned, with the Paris Agreement, but are based on achieving net zero by 2050. Essentially, we need to invest an additional 1.7 to 2% of EU GDP up to 2030, and after 2030, until 2050, basically. I mean, the numbers vary a bit. Compared to what we were spending over the last decade, right? In this case, you can also do the calculation based on the counterfactual scenario, but this tells you a bit the effort that needs to be done. On top of that, there are other investment needs related to the achievement of the rest of Green Deal targets. And basically, in order to understand the investment gaps, what we're trying to do is looking very simply at the finance mobilized right now compared to what would be needed to meet these targets. This is not a perfect exercise for various reasons. We cannot track absolutely everything. And right now, there is no systematic methodology across member states, which is a very big issue, especially in the national energy and climate plans. But, if you try to do the exercise looking at the totality of, EU funds that are being mobilized, essentially, so the major EU funds, such as cohesion policy funds, such as the post-pandemic recovery and resilience facility, ETS revenues, the modernization fund, and so on. So you add it all up, you look at spending plans, and essentially you're always systematically left with a very large gap, particularly, in the countries of the periphery of the European Union, which rely a lot, on EU funds essentially to fill those investment needs. Evidently, within those investment needs and on the investment gaps, there are differences. By far the largest share needs to go to decarbonizing transport. It's the biggest investment item that we need to meet over the next 30 years. Followed by housing, renovation, and so on. So decarbonization of household level emissions, etc., etc. And then you have grids and investments in the supply of energy, etc., etc. So this is more or less the picture right now. And the problem on top of that is that, in the current EU budget, we had Next Generation EU, which actually increased, the amount of finance available quite substantially. So Next Generation EU translated into approximately 300 billion more available for climate-related investments specifically. In total, it was like something like, 800 and something billion. But this ends in 2026, and at the moment, there is nothing to replace it. So if you couple that with a possible return of austerity at national level, so you have, national level possible cuts plus a sizable reduction of the EU budget after 2026, then, you end up in a perfect storm, because evidently, it means that it's going to be extremely challenging to meet all those investment needs, even if you assume that you manage to redirect a lot of the fossil-based investments and fossil fuel subsidies, etc. You would still end up needing more public finance. So this is more or less the state of play. In terms of the just transition specifically, perhaps let me elaborate a bit on that and the role of EU funds in that. I mean, the way I think about it, about this issue and the connection between, EU finance and public finance and the just transition, I think when we look at investment, spending is a different issue, and we can come back to that. I try to differentiate between three different things that are, in my opinion, are quite different. The first one is to look at the distributional impacts of investments that are targeting the transition per se, right? So what is the distributional impact of the type of investment selected, for the deployment of renewable energy, of renovation and housing, of transport, clean transport, of industry, etc. So that's the first question. The second concerns more key public infrastructure that underpins all the rest of the transitions, such as grid and so on, that were mentioned earlier. And the third component is investments that have nothing to do with the transition per se. So they are not targeting sectors that need to decarbonize, but include, broader public services such as education, training, health, and so on, that are necessary if we're speaking about just transformation, but, that are a different, in my view, investment component. So I don't have the time, evidently, to go into all of those, but perhaps let me give you a couple of examples in terms of what we know. So we've been, in a lot of detail at CAN on, we've been through the spending plans, so operational programs, recovery and resilience plans, and I think that there are a few things, and I'll close with that are very evident. The first one is that we clearly have an underinvestment, in community-based renewables and self-production, right? So typically the kind of investments that could have a positive distributional impact. There is a very big issue on the distributional consequence of energy efficiency policies, because those are very often not well targeted to energy poor households. And that means that a lot of that finance essentially targets middle-class households and does not prioritize essentially the reduction of energy poverty. And the third one is that we've seen systematically an underinvestment or not sufficient investment mobilized for public transport. So you have a lot of schemes around Europe using public funds essentially for the rollout, of electric vehicles, charging points, tax reliefs, for electric cars and so on. But when you look at the amounts of money mobilized essentially, in Central and Eastern Europe and in Southern Europe for public transport, these are substantially less and systematically less in both recovery and resilience plans and cohesion policy funds. Yeah.
Great, Olivier. So like Mathieu was definitely not wrong in picking the topic of transports, and it's such a big investment need and also important for just transformation, as you explained. Alex, I go back to you. Now that we did a first tour from the analysis a bit more to like, what do you see as the like greening of industrial policy? What should it look like if we want to align it with just transformation? And let's also make the link a bit now to the impact and the relation with the global south. Can you say a bit more about this?
Yeah, thank you, Frank. Actually, this is an interesting point now also after what Melanie was mentioning a bit like with the energy market, right? Which is very much the question also in the global south. I mean, yeah, it's evident that for the EU, the global south has always been, is there an echo? No? Always an important source of supply for the raw commodities, which is now also very much the case, still increasingly more so with the critical raw materials. I think it's interesting to look like within this whole discourse of just transition, decarbonization, whatever you choose to call it these days, is really how the EU is trying to use public money to support companies increasingly also in the global south in this new clean tech competition. In this sense, it's both export credit finance, it's development finance, namely the Global Gateway strategy that has been using a lot of these kind of funds to support this type of fragmentation, privatization of energy markets in the global south. And at the same time, not only not providing affordable energy for the people and not making the market situation more easy for electricity provision, but also very much forcing this technology dependence in the global south on the consumers in the end of the day. I think it's interesting to look at this industrial policy aspect as well, because, for instance, some of the countries, they understand that this is a problem, right? And some of them try to mobilize public finance to resist these kind of dynamics globally in the sense of the clean tech race for the subsidies and the market shares. For instance, Brazil and Colombia recently came out with their own industrial policies that are very interesting, written in part also with contributions from Mariana Mazzucato. I just leave it out there to think about it because it's also like very much centered on public-private partnerships, but also it contains very interesting elements about increasing domestic manufacturing. So really like looking at the domestic components as well to sort of lead on this also in the global south and not just feed this role of becoming consumers of European tech and very much driven by the patent rights at the moment. So in this sense, it's good to think about the fact that this, opportunities for expansion for the EU's private companies won't be indefinite, especially as we have many other competitors also that are much better positioned in the global market, have different subsidies, policies, etc. So it's really good to think beyond this private sector-oriented approach for industry, for growth in the end in Europe. I think what's really essential is the recognition that we do need a lot of investment for the transition, for the technologies also, as Olivier was just saying. Like, it's not like we can just drop this this notion. What's essential is to think what kind of investments we need, which is very much linked to the imperative to really have democratic industrial policy planning, to sort of democratically decide, have discussions on what kind of investments are actually needed, what kind of investments work for the people, and actually bring jobs, right? I think in this, I would like to refer to the degrowth critique of Mathieu, which is very interesting, revolving a lot about this notion of industrial planning, that of course, we need to degrow in some of the areas, but also like some of them have to increase. So this democratic participation is really essential, which at the moment it is not. I think any progressive industrial policy should be centered around strengthening labor interests, not capital interests as it is at the moment, which is really evident in support of these types of like many large companies instead of job opportunities properly. More concretely, labor interests would mean, of course, labor conditions, but also serious programs for job creation, such as public jobs investment programs, job guarantees. There's a lot that can be done in this regard, of course. Workers' ownership, shares in the companies, their impact in decision-making properly involved, which also at the moment there is very inspiring mobilization around this, both in the US and in the EU, I think, which vast network of organizations as us, but also politicians, of course, really have to support and endorse, because without that, it's very difficult to challenge these patterns. In the meantime, also, what is essential is to try to work together also on weakening the power of these huge companies, mostly in polluting industries that have huge lobbies that also prevent a lot of positive policies from advancing. This type of power distribution, if you want, can really be only achieved by proper policies that introduce conditionality. Because right now, any companies, regardless of their decarbonization plans, more or less can eventually benefit from clean tech support, for example, by the European Investment Bank, because of the exceptions they're making, under this, pretext of urgency at the moment, of the need for the transition, etc. And by asking these big public financiers to really focus on proper supply chains across Europe, covering all the countries, covering all the sectors, all the jobs that are needed to maintain, instead of financing a small number of oligopolies that may or may not work in the end, like especially with regard to hydrogen. So yeah, I would say that public jobs investment program is really a very key component of industrial policy, which right now is just completely dropped out of the discussion, because finance it's all concentrated around support to a handful of companies.
Okay. Alex, so you already gave many suggestions of what could be done in a much more interesting or progressive way to have an industrial plan that really helps people in the process of dealing with climate change. Melanie, I also have another question for you. So you were advocating public energy ownership, but what do you see as the key challenges to get there? Because as you already explained a bit, that's not really where we are right now. And do you have ideas of how we can overcome these challenges?
Yeah, so I think I could point to two key challenges. The first being that I think it's a challenge to advocate for public energy or public renewables in a context where it's not the case that there's no renewables online. We've had 2 decades of really strong state intervention into the electricity sector to induce electricity investment. Like the proliferation of renewables has generously benefited from industrial policy in other eras, such as the European feed-in tariff boom in the early 2000s, for example. So I think that we're in this tough spot where I think that there might be, political or policy voices that kind of speak in the name of a certain kind of pragmatism that say that this has led to renewables investment, these like various de-risking programs or subsidy programs. Therefore, it's just a matter of like fine-tuning this regime or somehow juicing a bit more investment from these existing actors or this existing apparatus. I think that the challenge is to really demonstrate and advocate that even though it is the case that this has brought some renewables online, this architecture, it's just insufficient for the task at hand, which is pretty widespread, like sweeping transformation through investment and divestment over, for many countries, a 5 to 10 year timeline based off of their power sector decarbonization target. It just is a completely different animal than just saying we've brought renewables online. But then I think also a key challenge is that because of the way that neoliberalism, has proliferated and restructured both states and economies, there just is a dearth of state capacity. So even in advocating for like the return of the state, or the state in the electricity sector, or building a public energy company, that's not just like a switch that you can flip. It really is a difficult challenge to build that state capacity. And I think that there again will be, voices advocating in a kind of like claiming a certain kind of pragmatism to say that there's a lack of state capacity. We've got 5 or 10 years, therefore let's just kind of keep at what we're doing. And I think the challenge is to demonstrate, or to acknowledge it's a challenge, but that decarbonization and just kind of like responding to the shocks of locked in climate destabilization will just kind of bring instability that state capacity building like has to, meet that. And so the need for state capacity is not the end point, it's the beginning, and we can have, fun and democratic processes to design, what that might look like.
Okay, Melanie, thanks a lot. It's interesting because the lack of state capacity is also something in the analysis that we've been doing on, especially the rollout of the recovery funds that Olivier was also mentioning. It's a really big challenge. Like at the moment, there's like a lot of public money, more money coming in than before, but states, and especially if you go to the lower levels of the state, they have really difficulties of processing these investments. Mathieu, you've done some work on the energy sector and how public energy could work in Belgium. Can you say a bit more about the discussions here in Belgium, and how could we get there to have more public control over energy?
Yes. So in fact, Belgium is a very good example of the consequences of the liberal market regarding energy, because in Belgium, we have one single private company, ENGIE, that owns 70% of the electricity production of the country. Why? Because ENGIE took over the control of the historic operator in the 90s. And so ENGIE controls all the nuclear production, most of gas power plants, and in fact also many wind farms. And in fact, this infrastructure, they have already been paid by Belgian workers through their bills, through public investments in the previous decades. And so it has become a real cash machine for ENGIE, because it's very profitable having this kind of infrastructure that have already been paid. And so ENGIE made 15 billion profits between 1998 and 2020, and then 9 more billion profits during the energy crisis. And the other consequences of this monopoly is the fact that ENGIE benefits from every political decision regarding energy in Belgium. In the late 90s, the Belgian government decided to close nuclear power plants. And so ENGIE took advantage of this to obtain public subsidies for green energy, so for wind and solar power, but also to maintain and even build new gas power stations. Now, the government decided to extend the life of certain nuclear reactors, and so ENGIE again received subsidies for the work needed, and also guaranteed electricity price. And most importantly, ENGIE will be able to pass the cost and the risk regarding radioactive wastes on the public. And so this is a very good example on the fact that if we want to have a democratic control on energy, we must regain control on ENGIE. But how to do it? And of course, how to do it without paying for these future losses and costs. In fact, I think that the first point is to break the profit machine. It means that we need to regain control on the electricity and gas prices by setting them on the basis of production costs or public choices, and not on the basis of market place regarding gas and electricity, as it was before the liberalization. And of course, we then need to negotiate international trade price on a country-by-country basis, for example. And in fact, it's not an utopia. It is how it works now between Switzerland and the European neighbors, because Switzerland is not part of the European market. And it works. And I think it is important to know it, because it is difficult to imagine that we create a whole European consensus on breaking the energy market. But as the Swiss example shows, we can completely imagine that some countries leave the European energy market without waiting this whole European consensus and continue to have exchanges with the country that decided to keep the market, for example. Then the next challenge is to regain control on the production itself. In Belgium, this means regain control on energy facilities. And in fact, of course, without paying a third time for plants that have already been paid 2 times by the bills and during the investment. So in other words, we need to confiscate the equipment without compensation. And of course, there are texts of in the international laws that explain that we can follow this path because the way the energy is managed goes against the collective interest, for example. But of course, there is also a balance of power. And if we think about energy, we can say that probably the French state, that is the first stakeholder of energy, will probably be against this kind of nationalization. But again, if we look at the whole picture, and if we heard an expert like Aurélien Bernier, which is a French expert on energy, we can learn some very interesting elements. What he said is the fact that with the amount of public aid that has been released in France during the energy crisis, we could have renationalized energy 3 times. And what does it mean? It means that a progressive government in France would be advised to work with Belgium to go towards a public takeover of energy. And in fact, finally, of course, this kind of change of ownership will be a class struggle. Why? Because controlling energy is a key lever for deciding how we produce, how we travel, how we eat homes. And a change of model will probably not happen in courts or in European or on Belgian parliaments, and of course, not in the boards of this kind of private giants. We need to build a balance of power based on the social movements and based on the history, because it was the mobilization of the working class after the Second World War that led to the public takeover, not only on electricity production, but also on part of the petrol oil producer and also on coal mines in many countries, such as France, Great Britain, or Italy. And most of these public energy services were maintained until the 80s, thanks to the trade union and social struggles. And so today, the fight against this private control on energy should be one of the central struggle of the environmental movement, the trade union, and the left parties. And what is interesting is the fact that we see this kind of movement that is building brick by brick, let's say. And so I think that we can be optimistic about this, but we must be very concrete in the next month, in the next years, because we need to regain control of this kind of big actors. These are the key for having green and affordable energy in the futures, and then also for having a green industry. Your microphone is shut down.
Again, still don't hear me? Now you hear me? Yes. I have this mic that turns off every now and then, especially during webinars. So no, a lot of food for thought, Mathieu, and action, of course. Incredible how much this is thought through, and these kind of examples also in the world today that you're mentioning. Really think we have a lot of things to think about and work to do. Olivier, for the last part, can you tell a bit, like, okay, if we want to have a bit more, like, if we want to have more public sector control and go to a just transformation in the sectors like energy and industry that we've been talking about, what are EU financing mechanisms that could be used today for such an approach? Do you think that there's things that are there now that we can use, or we really have to start over and we have to invent new things?
Yeah, good question. No, in theory, right? But then we get into a whole lot of complications, right? But you know, it's member states that decide essentially where they spend their money. So they design spending plans, right, for the use of specific EU funds. I'm talking about the largest one here, and I'm not going to go into all the nuances of that. Some of the funds are like on a case-by-case basis, but for the biggest funds, it's essentially member states drafting spending plans. So in theory, you know, they have the freedom to decide how they spend that money. However, all this evidently is constrained by state aid rules, right, and other regulations that potentially can act as a barrier to some of the stuff that both Mathieu and Melanie were talking about earlier, right, in terms of public control on certain industries. There are all sorts of regulation on the electricity market, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, that needs to be taken into account as well. But you know, if you wanted to have a much bigger rollout of cooperative energy schemes and so on and so forth, for instance, you know, this is absolutely feasible within, you know, the current frameworks. So this is a battle that has to be given at member state level, right? So that's the first point. But perhaps let me flag as well a couple of stuff from the current approach to industrial policy in the EU, and I'm going to leave the IB outside here, but we're seeing a trend, right, of more mobilization of funds, unfortunately actually taking money from the funds that are not destined for that originally for industrial policy. So we had evidently, you know, the relaxation of state aid rules across the EU, supposedly to respond to the IRA. Then the European Commission set up the Strategic Technologies for Europe platform, which recycles some of the existing funds into industry. But the risk is that in the next EU budget, we're going to see a much bigger chunk of funds dedicated to that. And I think that one of the issues here, you know, even if we accept that, you know, it's not necessarily going to be under public ownership, is that the current approach to industrial policy isn't just completely crude from a fairness point of view, but even from an effectiveness point of view. Because if you look at, you know, for instance, the question of conditionality, right? When funds are granted to industry, you look at examples from all around the world, you know, there is conditionality more often than not in the design of industrial policies, right? And this is completely absent from the current EU approach, which is essentially throwing money at the problem unconditionally. And the second thing, which is completely absent in terms of, you know, understanding, because I think by and large European elites as well have forgotten how to do industrial policy, is that industrial policy is not just about building, you know, essentially financing the supply side, but also building the demand outlet for those green technologies and for their deployments. And I think this is also, you know, completely absent. In essence, you know, without all this like building the demand base requires public finance because it presupposes key public infrastructure. For example, the fact that 99% of electric buses are in the streets of China, is exactly what creates the demand outlets for an industrial policy in terms of building electric buses and electric bus fleet in China. And I think that right now, the approach of the Commission is basically completely crude on that topic, on those topics. I think public finance needs to especially target the demand base, because otherwise the rollout of these technologies is simply not going to happen. And you can think of, the several sectors that are mentioned before and do the exercise, in terms of rollouts, and think about where public finance is needed, and this becomes very, very obvious. So I think this is a key battle that we're going to face ahead of the next EU budget, with the new Parliament and Commission, in terms of ensuring that any additional funds that are mobilized for industrial policy across the EU are way better designed than they currently are, and evidently way fairer in terms of guaranteeing, social rights, employment rights, and so on and so forth.
A lot for these last thoughts. We're already going over time. There were a few contributions in the Q&A, but they were not really questions. We've already dealt with them. Unless there's a really urgent question by someone, I would suggest that we leave it here, so that some of us can end the day and the others can start. But definitely, I would like to thank everyone. It was the last, but I think it was definitely not the least of our series of webinars. We went in depth on a lot of really important issues. I want to thank the whole panel and all the people who participated a lot, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you.